I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Henry Kissinger. Let's roll the video.
Your champagne, Mr. Burnside.
Thank you. You're sitting in seat 2A. Wonder who'll be sitting next to you in seat 2B.
Your seat, sir.
Hey.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. It's Henry Kissinger. Ready for a good chat?
Well, that was a bit of a harrowing meeting, wasn't it? Isn't it nice to have a moment to relax and decompress?
Good morning.
Oh, look. It's Eric Schmidt. Ready for a nice chat? The Economist. Broaden your horizons.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the real Dr. Kissinger. Thank you, Henry. If you looked at that ad with me, I'm carrying your book when I get into the elevator. Thank you all for coming. Dr. Kissinger and I have talked for a long time about the future of the world, and I would argue that Dr. Kissinger is one of the foremost experts on the future of the physical world, how the world really works. And of course, his contributions to America and the world are without question. I would also argue that we have a pretty strong role here in the digital world. And it's the combination of the physical and the digital that will drive a lot of the future. So we've agreed to have a conversation about the two together. And Dr. Kissinger just published an extraordinary book on the structure of the world. I like to think of it as how the world works. I, of course, wrote how Google works, right? So perhaps we can start, Dr. Kissinger, by saying, how did you want to do this, and why are we here?
Well, I was brought up in the non-digital world. And while I've learned some of its instruments, my thinking is shaped by the period before the interconnected world. So Eric and I have been meeting at various conferences, and I've been fascinated by what he knows. And I don't know whether he's been fascinated by what I know, but it drew us into conversation. And my grandchildren are so far ahead of me in the digital world that it's embarrassing to me. So by exchanging ideas, Eric and I have fallen into a rather extensive dialogue. And when he suggested that we take it here into the conversation, I was very interested to do that. That's why I'm here.
In your book, let's start by saying, in your book, you talk about the Westphalian system. I didn't know what the Westphalian system was. But in your book, you say it's relatively young, and it maybe is not permanent. How will the nation state evolve in this interconnected world?
Well, I wrote this book almost by accident. I was having dinner with a friend from Yale, and I was talking about the nature of leadership and about doing some case histories on leaders. And he said, why don't you put that aside and write about something that really bothers you now? And he said, write about what problem bothers you most. And so I concluded what bothers me most is what is sort of grandiloquently called world order. And it arises in the following way, in response to your question, Eric. What we consider the international system, and what probably most of you consider the international system, is a number of states in relation with each other that serve each other with diplomats and that balance each other, and there are certain rules. You cannot cross borders, and you can't intervene in international affairs, in domestic affairs. And so people think that that is the natural order of the universe. It, however, has existed only in the West, and only in Western Europe, and only since about the middle of the 17th century, when there was a 30 years war in Europe that killed a third of the population with conventional weapons. And then a group of leaders got together in the Westphalia in Germany with the Catholic leaders in one town and the Protestant leaders in another. Very few names of these leaders have survived, but they constructed the system that has lasted since then. And it's based on the idea that a number of sovereign states are going to balance each other through a balance of power, and that the balance of power is maintained by a certain common system of justice, that is, that the system is considered not perfectly just, but just enough so that nobody wants to overthrow the whole system and seek adjustment within it. That's in China, that concept never existed. In China, the idea of order was that China is the center of the universe, and every other state that existed in the world was related to China in some kind of a tributary system. Then you could never really become Chinese, but you could have a closer or less close relationship with China. Then in the Islamic world, there was what I would call a theocratic system that determined the hierarchy. So now, for the first time in history, the various regions of the world are related to each other through technology and with instantaneous communication, and so they can affect each other. Right. The Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire were not part of the same world order. They didn't know of each other, and they didn't know how to interact with each other. So that's the problem I was trying to deal with in this book, and that I think is one of the challenges of our time.
So all of us are very excited about globalization, and in particular the rise of 2 billion people going from poverty into middle class, mostly in Asia. And for example, the vast majority of them will be connected to the internet, they'll be using smartphones, they'll join our economic order. As you know, before World War I, an economist named Engel wrote essentially an article that said that because of trade, there would never be wars again. This book was written in 1909. We all know what happened after that. So I make the same assumption, that the Westphalian system, plus this growth of modernity and commerce and so forth, means a world of less war, less conflict. Am I wrong?
Yes, you're probably wrong. No, you're not. It's complicated. You are right that, of course, there's instantaneous communication, and people know about what is going on in other parts of the world. But people don't only disagree with each other because they disagree as to facts. They more frequently disagree with each other because they may agree on the facts, but they interpret them differently. And so that the relevance of facts to a problem is sometimes more important than the facts, or at least as important as the facts themselves. So you take now in the Middle East, the conflict between Shia and Sunni interpretations of Islam. They both accept the Quran, they both accept the basic theology. The split occurred about the fourth succession after the Prophet, and its bitterness has, if anything, it hasn't become more in the contemporary period, but the technical means of bringing it to others has increased. So one really has to separate matters that depend on factual conclusions. I think will be easier to solve, or at least be possible to solve. Matters that depend on interpretation and ideology or religion may become harder to solve because of the means of spreading the different views and making them clash with each other. So I think actually the frequency of wars has declined.
Declined.
I've seen a study to that effect. I think there's a book out that says that. But the intensity of the consequences has multiplied.
Do you think that in the technological future, where more people are connected, there'll be more conflict because of this ideological fight? It'll be easier to fight. Like the example I would offer is ISIS, which is a horrific organization who are very effective at using social media, even though they themselves have shut down the internet within their part of Iraq.
I think the cultural differences, unless they can be diminished, the mere interconnection does not necessarily avoid conflicts. I mean, if you look around the world today, you have the Middle East crisis, or whatever, which is really 3 or 4 different revolutions occurring simultaneously. Some against the existing governments on the usual economic issues. Some on the Shia-Sunni split. Some on the, which would be the case in Syria, of ethnic groups. And over it all, a revolution against the state system that was brought into the area by the West, in which the boundaries were drawn in 1920, reflecting no historic or cultural reality. So all of these revolutions are going on simultaneously. Each of them, and especially ISIS, is trying to use social media and doing it extremely effectively vis-a-vis us for the purpose of intimidating us and to show how serious they are for the rest of the part of the Muslim community, to show the ferocity with which they stand up to the West, which is in itself an attraction. So I would say that the interconnectedness works both ways in this situation. which is not an argument against interconnectedness, it's an argument to try to learn from the consequences of interconnectedness.
As you know, China has a different view of the digital world than America. And you famously opened China. Extraordinary achievement. If I take the view that China has a unique view of itself, right? And I also take the view that economic growth in China will mean great prosperity for the Chinese, my naive and optimistic view that that's positive for the world, and all the things that we've talked about. What happens when China is as strong as America?
One has to understand how China looks at the world in order to, and you all have to understand, I am not a China scholar. I arrived in China in 1971, essentially ignorant of China because I guess President Nixon sent me because I was on his staff and he could keep an eye on me that way. And anyone else he sent would be harder to control. And I couldn't tell the bureaucracy what I was doing, so I had minimal preparation. And that became apparent in the first hour of my conversation with the Chinese premier, who was Zhou Enlai. And I made a statement, and I was going along nicely, and I was saying suddenly, so now I find myself here in this land of mystery. So he put up his hand and said, what is so mysterious about China? And I said something banal, and he said, think about the following problem. There is 1 billion of us, and it's not mysterious to us, which is a very profound, really good point, a profound one. So I tried over the succeeding years and over 100 visits to China since then, to try to understand how they think of them, of themselves. Now, the Chinese do not think historically of conquering territory by force and colonizing it then and holding it the way the Europeans have and the way others have. The Chinese think, the general rule, that they will influence other societies by the majesty of their performance, by the magnitude of their efforts, and that they will then draw them into a pattern of relationships that is based on cultural and psychological domination, backed up by a military force which will be used, in a phrase I've often heard, to teach a lesson, not to conquer so much, although indirectly that may be a result. So that's a different way of thinking. Now, what will China do? Well, there are two ways, and it's of great importance for our future. If it goes the traditional way, then China will gradually spread its influence as its power grows. And if the difference between us gets too great, they will expect that other nations will recognize that fact and act accordingly. If, however, the difference does not become so great, if it's sort of an economics analysis of per capita, then we and the Chinese have this challenge. If it goes the traditional way and into normal historic conflicts, there will be a series of irritations that go on over a period of time, one of which somewhere along the line will lead to a confrontation. That's the history of Europe with World War I. They had years, decades of confrontations, each of which was settled, and then one no worse than any other suddenly blew up. So that's one model. The other model would be that we now decide at this stage, when Eric can still ask that question as a future prospect, that both countries decide we want to avoid this. And we will try to develop a partnership between potential adversaries that work together on some common problems. And actually, at this moment, both the Chinese and the American presidents are saying they want to do that. The trouble has been they haven't yet found a way to do it. And one reason is that we, the Americans, think every difficulty has a solution. And therefore, we segment the world into problems. And each problem gets solved with concentrated effort. The Chinese in the political world don't think this way. They think every solution of a problem is an admissions ticket to another set of problems. So you therefore have to think conceptually and in terms of process. But right now we are actually living through a moment when the two sides are feeling their way towards each other to bridge that gap. And I don't know, one can't tell whether they'll succeed. So when the Chinese president comes here next September, there are going to be a lot of surface things that are going on. But the underlying issue will be, can they convince each other that they're working together? Or will they leave from each other thinking, well, we'll manage the competition better for our side?
So there's a technological question in many of these areas, but the one that confounds me the most is what to do about the spread of nuclear weapons. You have written extensively on Iran and what's going to happen in Iran. And my amateur view of this is it's very difficult and as we know, Persia is a very proud, very old culture, very wealthy and sophisticated culture, very prideful. And the evidence is that they want nuclear weapons. It seems to me that it's very difficult to prevent a country that has the means and really wants them. Do you agree? Is there a way where we can slow this down? Is there a way that technology could change this? Is there something that we could do because of the obvious concerns here?
Well, because one question is, why do they want nuclear weapons? And this probably has many answers, one of which is that Iran, as you said, is an old civilization. It's the one country that was overrun by the Arabs when Islam spread around that part of the world. that did not adopt Arabic as a language, that maintained its own language, maintained its own literature, and then about 1,000 years into that process, adopted the Shiite version of Islam in order to distinguish itself from the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was at its borders. So there's this great sense of identity in Iran. At the same time, they have adopted a jihadist version of Shia religion, the leadership has, which is really not fairly indistinguishable from the ISIS version, except that they don't do such brutal demonstrations, but the objective is essentially indistinguishable. So that is the world in which they live. But let me get to the issue of nuclear weapons. I've been writing on that subject since long before most of you were born. And the fundamental problem is this. When people ask me what was the problem that bothered me most when I was in government, what caused me, nothing caused me sleepless nights, but what did I worry about? It was, what would I say if the president says to me, we have come to the limit of our diplomacy, now do we go to nuclear weapons? And the reason that bothered me, as it should, is because the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons are so horrendous that you so transform the world that it is a serious question whether any person has a right to take that responsibility to inflict that level of devastation on mankind in relation to what problem. So this, as long as its management of these weapons was in the hands of very few countries that had similar risks, you could still imagine how the world could manage. But once it spreads into areas in which the conflict between the participants is extremely intense, and in which they may have religious conviction, in which the destruction of life may be an advance towards a better life, and once where the technology is not enough elaborated so that you can develop fail-safe systems and early warning so that preemption gets pushed into the system, then you have a really tough problem. And the challenge for me in the Iranian weapon is that it will almost mathematically produce the same desire in other comparable countries in the region. And if a weapon is ever used and we wake up and find that 100,000 people have been killed in 5 minutes, that will affect human consciousness, must affect human consciousness around the world, also in relation to their government. So my concern with these discussions now is they're an extremely complicated technical stuff that will be debated. But the key issue to me is the propensity of the achievement by Iran of nuclear capability, military capability, triggering the same thing in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey. And then these countries face each other. And then here we said, we're trying to produce stability. And I haven't even mentioned Israel, which is a potential target for all of them. So that's what one should concern oneself with in this Iranian negotiation. Could one keep them from doing it? You know, this were a seminar, you could say you can theoretically do it by getting them into a value system in which they don't want it, which is unlikely, or by threatening them with consequences that they don't want to face. That opportunity, if it ever existed, is past. So in this world, we'll now have to see, we'll have to give it a chance for the follow-on negotiations to succeed. But at the end of it will be the question, if Iran winds up with nuclear weapons, so will other countries. And then what will we do?
If the point is past where we can prevent it, then does it necessarily have to happen?
You know, I wait because I don't think, I think probably yes, because in most bureaucratic organizations, at least most governmental bureaucratic organizations, while you like to think of the long term, you must deal with the short term. And all the pressures of the short term will be to continue, while breaking with it would be a major decision. I would think that we are probably beyond the point where that program can be stopped by American efforts, probably. But I would respect the administration for trying to stop it.
We need a better solution. Maybe we can think of some technological solutions, better detection, other ways of monitoring and so forth. Maybe we can invent
but
something.
The technological solution will help you only if you've already decided to do it. The reason the Iranians started this program around 2000, they stopped it temporarily when we invaded Iraq, because they were afraid they were next on the list. They resumed it when they realized we were stuck in Iraq. And every time they continue, they create another interest group that is concerned with continuing it. And so their basic argument I would think that it would take really overwhelming force to convince them that the costs would be too great.
In this context, let's talk about Russia. If we go back to the Westphalian system and order, the invasion of Crimea is clearly a violation of a whole bunch of agreements. The Russians are behaving in a way different from the contract, if you will, the European contract, as China are. We face, right, the technology industry faces very significant restrictions in Russia now for the internet use. Twitter has been under great attack. There are new laws that are blocking certain technological solutions in Russia. Russia itself is largely dependent on oil and gas revenue, which is in fact in trouble. If China is a different structure than America and Europe, what's Russia?
Well, Russia has never in its mind been fully part of the Westphalian system because it has had a totally different history. And it's also a different animal. The Westphalian system was based on states with fairly homogeneous populations in relatively small areas, the European states, with a very comparable culture. When the Enlightenment started in Europe, Russia was governed by Mongols. When America was discovered, it was still governed by Mongols. When the Westphalian Treaty was negotiated, is about the time that the present Russian state emerged as a state. It had nothing to do with Europe. It didn't enter Europe until another 100 years later. And it's a territory with 9 time zones. So no European state has had this geographic extent of Russia. So it is a country on an open plain under threat of attack from both east and west. It has caused more wars, but it has also, than most countries, it has prevented, on the other hand, the domination of the world by Mongols, by Swedes, by French, by Germans. So it is a country that is obsessed with its security and with its identity, which is culturally European, geographically divided between continents. So the perception of the current crisis in Russia is totally different from our perception, and Putin has 80% public support, and I've just been told of a poll that was taken in February in which that percentage has remained fairly constant, and where even 50% of the opposition groups agree with him, plus all the others. So one has to understand these realities. Crimea became part of Ukraine in 1954, only when Ukraine was part of Russia because Khrushchev assigned it to the Ukraine as part of a power struggle inside the Communist Party. But it's not to justify what Russia did, but it grew out of this whole sequence grew out of a crisis over how one should perceive the future of Ukraine, which by Russians is considered part of their patrimony, which by Europeans is considered just another state. And over the issue of what arrangements for its security should be made. I'll just mention my own view of a partial issue. If one looks at Ukraine as a strategic asset to one side or the other, the following situation arises. If the eastern border of NATO is put at the eastern border of Ukraine, it is within 200 miles of Stalingrad and 300 miles of Moscow. And that, given the historic experience of Russia, is hard to take. If the security border of Russia is put at the western border of Ukraine, it is along the border of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and that's hard to take for the West. So my maybe simple-minded idea is Ukraine should be treated like Austria or Finland, not part of a strategic system, but as a meeting place, as a place where the two sides can cooperate, and if they can't cooperate, at least not confront each other. That is the underlying issue. How to get to a solution of it. But you can't, if one looks at it entirely from the rules of the Westphalian system, it's not a Putin problem, it's a Russia problem.
Right.
How does one conceive Russia? And even if one disagrees with my particular interpretation of it, one has to start with an analysis of what Russia represents. And then what we represent, then we can see what can be done.
So the reason I asked about Russia was that one way to deal with Iran is for Russia to put pressure on Iran. Another, as an example, one way to deal with North Korea is to have China put pressure on North Korea. So in a multi-party world, could we see a situation where the problems of North Korea are resolved by pressure from China, and the problems in Iran, which would negatively affect Russia, are solved by pressure from Russia? In other words, why don't they police the terrible behaviors near their borders?
Well, it's partly a question of attitude. If we say we know what all the problems of the world are, and we're going to hand out assignments, like school assignments,
Right.
And you, Russia, take care of Iran, and you, China, take care of North Korea, it won't work. And we have a tendency in that direction. But if we ask ourselves, if one understands what would be an interest of Russia towards nuclear weapons on its borders or China, from their point of view, we would probably find that on this point, what you described earlier, the factual conclusions would be very close to each other, that they don't want them for their reasons. So then it depends what our overall relationship is with these countries. With Russia now in the middle of the conflict over Ukraine, cooperation with America is not a great motive to do anything. So their willingness to help vis-a-vis Iran is somewhat affected, although no matter what we do, they cannot want a nuclear. The same is true of China and North Korea. If we can develop together some concept of how we deal with the emergence of nuclear weapons in the world, because whatever our differences are, we should be together on not having nuclear weapons become conventional weapons for strategy.
The math.
That's an opportunity, actually.
The math on nuclear weapons is so horrific for the environment, pollution, economics, human life, even in the areas that are not part of the conflict zone, that it would be a very, very tragic thing for the world.
I completely agree with that, and it's how the challenge for political leaders is how you get from the recognition of a problem to its solution.
So I wanted to finish by talking about leadership and also technology a little bit, and then have some questions that have been submitted by our audience. When I listen to the political leadership in the world, they don't speak with this level of understanding of world order, negotiation, and so forth. They speak from the standpoint of their doctrine. So the Chinese speak from we're right and you're wrong. Americans say we're right, you're wrong. Europeans say we're right, you're wrong, and so forth. You've said before, and you write in your book, about the importance of leadership and the importance of negotiation. Why don't we have such strong leaders today? Is technology making those leaders harder to find or easier to find? In other words, why don't we have more? I know you admire President de Gaulle. I know you admire Lee Kuan Yew, a number of people like that who you as great statesmen. Why don't we have more leaders who can have this discussion at this level and drive the world to a safer place?
There are many, obviously, there are many reasons. It's not necessarily true that strong leaders drive the world to a safer place, because strong leaders may also produce visions that unsettle the world. To achieve what you're talking about, you need strong leaders that recognize the same problem. They don't have to come up with the same solutions at first. But then the issue is also, what is a strong leader? I think strong leader, it's got to be somebody who recognizes a vision and implements it, even when the facts do not at first make it obvious. That's how Google was created. That's what happened here in the Valley. That quality is harder to come by now, partly because of the technology that you have created. When I started being concerned with getting involved at the periphery of politics, I was working with Nelson Rockefeller. He suffered from the illusion that you become president by having the best program. So he spent a lot of time on substance. And I had never heard of focus groups. But now the technology has developed to a point in which how to achieve immediate impact has become so refined that you don't have time to concentrate as much as you should on where you're going to go. And you become so emotionally dependent on confirmation by these groups and by the social networks that you really don't know what you can do as an effort beyond the consensus. And I think that's one of the reasons why leaders now, candidates now, spend a lot of their effort on things that are different from what they have to do when they get into office. Now, there must be a limit to my tactlessness.
At Google, we like to hear. My final question, and then we'll come to audience questions, is when you look forward and you understand technology from the people around you and what you see and you worry, what do you want the technology industry to do to make things better? We would answer, right? So our answer is roughly the following. We're going to get everyone connected. We're going to give everyone an internet connection and a smartphone, hopefully Android. And they're going to have all this information. Their education systems are going to be much stronger. They're going to be able to have better commerce, they're going to have better globalization. That we believe as an industry that we are in a global movement to get everyone connected and everyone empowered so they can each and one of them can be much better, much happier, better educated, safer, happier, etc. What would you say to that challenge? What would you like us to do more of?
You know, you're an important teacher feature to me of this technology, because I don't get exposed to it in my normal, and that's what, and you've been kind enough to invite me here on a number of occasions, which has been eye-opener to me. So when I criticize it, it's not the effort that is being done, it's the implications of having such vast power. The interconnectedness is, of course, I think that's highly desirable. But your theory seems to be that everybody draws the same conclusion from facts. And I think it's the interpretation of facts and the definition of their relevance that creates the real differences. So a level of, right now, nothing like the ability that you have created to punch a button and to get information has ever existed. That's a fantastic development. It gives you a power, though, for ordering it, which is bound to get challenged. That's inherent in the process, but I'll put that issue aside. But when you create a humanity that is used to this, for whom it becomes common, you could say it develops a certain laziness about conceptions, because you can always find out the facts, and you don't have to worry about their interconnectedness. And it's in the interconnectedness of facts. So what I would like to see you do is to go from the level that you are now covering to, okay, what does it mean? And with what other set of facts and relation to what objective is this relevant? And build a debate thing into this. Obviously, if I knew how to do it, I'd be a very wealthy man.
You'd work here at Google.
But that is what we need. There's no point complaining about the existence of the search engines. They perform this function of interconnecting us. Of course, when I look at the order of things you display about me, I would order it differently.
Yes, there are many people on that list, Dr. Kissinger.
But that's a minor. This is what I would like. This is what I would look for. This is what we need, and then we should try to create. Profound thinking has occurred when people took a body of facts and challenged it and developed other theories about it. And the danger is that when you're so good at collecting facts that you'll read things.
So the answer is go up to a higher level of understanding and meaning.
Yes, but what does one mean by that? One really ought to discuss that. I can just tell you what I think the issue is.
I think we should. We have another 10 minutes or so. Why don't we take some audience questions? We have an internal system where people have contributed questions, and let me read some of the highest rated ones. The first one, in your excellent World Order book, you seem to portray nationalism as an invented concept which outlived its usefulness. Would you agree with this assessment? If so, what would replace nationalism in your view?
I don't know that. That's what many of these crises That's what many of these crises are about. And you see in Europe that nationalism declines for the system, but it still exists within the countries
Right.
for their internal. So what I think will happen in the Middle East is that sometime in this process, some units will emerge that represent a political consensus. They may not be nations at all in our old sense. And in a way, that's what's happening around the world. And it's one of the, I don't know the answer to that question.
Another question, this comes to this question of sort of principle versus negotiation. How can the United States normalize relationship with enemies, such as Iran, while not alienating long-term allies, such as Israel and the Saudis?
Well, when you normalize relations, it must be because you have said to yourself that conflict has run us into a dead end, and we want to open a new avenue, a new direction. You don't necessarily have to know where the direction will take you. I had the good fortune of being able to open relations with China. I say good fortune because the constellation that made that possible was not created by Nixon or me. We recognized it. That was, and so, and I had other negotiations with adversaries. I think the first thing one needs to know is the adversary's perception of the world. And so because what one is trying to reconcile is perceptions that were different enough to produce the previous conflict. And so at a minimum you want to reduce that conflict to a proportion so that you can work together. Or, if it goes well, to develop objectives which you can pursue together. So, there are different ways of doing this. Some people think that the way to do this is to take very tiny little steps and so get used to it. And I used to call it the salami tactic of negotiation. You slice it very thin. My own view, but this is I would usually tell my opposite number quite accurately what my objective was. Because my reasoning would be that there are a lot of little things that happen all the time. But if you want to achieve a consensus on a direction, you should try to achieve a parallel interpretation, or at a minimum, the other side should understand what you're trying to do and not waste too much time analyzing you.
So in other words, tell them your worldview and what you're trying to achieve.
No,
right?
tell them I am here to achieve this.
Okay.
And here is why I think this might be desirable. And you must have experienced this more than I. When you enter a negotiation, you often know what your bottom line is. And some people will say, just get there very slowly because maybe you don't ever have to reach it. I usually offered my bottom line right away.
Right up front. Just right up front, you say, this is what I want.
Well, maybe 5%,
Okay.
but to have a little margin so that
I
it
want a
doesn't
big
look like an
country and a little
ultimatum.
country too. No.
But there must be lawyers in this group who will tell me the exact opposite. But that would be my approach.
Another question from our audience. Where do you see the USA-Cuba relationship in 5 years and 25 years?
Where will we
Cuba.
be? I don't have the answer would have to be, but where we will be in 25 years.
With Cuba.
In 2 years
25 years with Cuba.
with Cuba. I don't think Cuba is a big problem. I really don't. The problem is we've talked ourselves into a position. Most of the rest of the world doesn't care what our relation with Cuba is. I think we will, but I would expect that Cuba will not be a revolutionary state, that we will have a normal relationship with Cuba. But Cuba is not a factor in world politics. And it has some impact in Latin America, which disappears once our relations are normalized. It will be an advanced Caribbean state.
And let's have our final audience question. This is about domestic policy in America, and as you know, there have been a great deal of discussion about the role of the presidency and the Congress. Domestic politics in the U.S. is becoming increasingly polarized. How does this affect our relations and affect the rest of the world?
I think the polarization is very bad for the relation with the rest of the world. Partly symbolically, and partly actually. Symbolically, because for the rest of the world, America always has represented a certain elemental force which may do a lot of things that are weird, but in the end comes together on great objectives. And in a way, it does. When I was in government, we were going crazy about the energy problem. And a lot of projects were started then in the 70s that everybody said, well, it can never work. And it didn't work then, but 30 years later, it did work. And the energy revolution is a huge event in our time, which we take sort of for granted. But we now have a deadlock in government. When I first entered government in the Nixon administration, I thought life was horrible because we had the Vietnam protests, but still there were a certain number of senators to whom any president could go and say the country needs this. And no matter what the party was, you could count on them to try to shape it. Now, all the leaders are sort of wrapped up in their own constituencies and the constant need for re-election. That this safety net for the government is disappearing. Partly because so many people now think that you can become president without serving any time in the Congress. So that's just a stepping stone for them to greater things. That's a problem we have to overcome. And I have to tell you right away, it's one thing to say there's a problem. That doesn't mean that one necessarily knows all the answers to it or any of the answers to it.
Well, perhaps we'll end up with some Chinese views that some problems can be solved now and some problems will be solved in the future. I think you all know why this is an extraordinary man and an extraordinary leader. And it's extraordinary to me, using extraordinary a lot, to have you here for our third time. Thank you for your advice, your suggestions, and I can assure you that Googlers will be working on meaning. So thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger.
Thank you very much. That China is the center of the universe, and every other state that existed in the world was related to China in some kind of a tributary system. Then you could never really become Chinese, but you could have a closer or less close relationship with China. Then in the Islamic world, there was what I would call a theocratic system that determined the hierarchy. So now, for the first time in history, the various regions of the world are related to each other through technology and with instantaneous communication, and so they can affect each other. Right. The Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire were not part of the same world order. They didn't know of each other, and they didn't know how to interact with each other. So that's the problem I was trying to deal with in this book, and that I think is one of the challenges of our time.
So all of us are very excited about globalization, and in particular the rise of 2 billion people going from poverty into middle class, mostly in Asia. And for example, the vast majority of them will be connected to the internet, they'll be using smartphones, they'll join our economic order. As you know, before World War I, an economist named Engel wrote essentially an article that said that because of trade, there would never be wars again. This book was written in 1909. We all know what happened after that. So of the world, and I would argue that Dr. Kissinger is one of the foremost experts on the future of the physical world, how the world really works. And of course, his contributions to America and the world are without question. I would also argue that we have a pretty strong role here in the digital world. And it's the combination of the physical and the digital that will drive a lot of the future. So we've agreed to have a conversation about the two together. And Dr. Kissinger just published an extraordinary book on the structure of the world. I like to think of it as how the world works. I, of course, wrote how Google works, right? So perhaps we can start, Dr. Kissinger, by saying, how did you want to do this, and why are we here?
Well, I was brought up in the non-digital world. And while I've learned some of its instruments, my thinking is shaped by the period before the interconnected world. So Eric and I have been meeting at various conferences, and I've been fascinated by what he knows. And I don't know whether he's been fascinated by what I know, but it drew us into conversation. And my grandchildren are so far ahead of me in the digital world that it's embarrassing to me. So by exchanging ideas, Eric and I have fallen into a rather extensive dialogue. And when he suggested that we take it here into the conversation, I was very interested to do that. That's why I'm here.
In your book, let's start by saying, in your book, you talk about the Westphalian system. I didn't know what the Westphalian system was. But in your book, you say it's relatively young, and it maybe is not permanent. How will the nation state evolve in this interconnected world?
Well, I wrote this book almost by accident. I was having dinner with a friend from Yale, and I was talking about the nature of leadership and about doing some case histories on leaders. And he said, why don't you put that aside and write about something that really bothers you now? And he said, write about what problem bothers you most. And so I concluded what bothers me most is what is sort of grandiloquently called world order. And it arises in the following way, in response to your question, Eric. What we consider the international system, and what probably most of you consider the international system, it's a number of states in relation with each other that serve each other with diplomats and that balance each other, and there are certain rules. You cannot cross borders, and you can't intervene in international affairs, in domestic affairs. And so people think that that is the natural order of the universe. It, however, has existed only in the West, and only in Western Europe, and only since about the middle of the 17th century, when there was a 30 years war in Europe that killed a third of the population with conventional weapons. And then a group of leaders got together in the Westphalia in Germany with the Catholic leaders in one town and the Protestant leaders in another. Very few names of these leaders have survived, but they constructed the system that has lasted since then. And it's based on the idea that a number of sovereign states are going to balance each other through a balance of power, and that the balance of power is maintained by a certain common system of justice, that is, that the system is considered not perfectly just, but just enough so that nobody wants to overthrow the whole system and seek adjustment within it. That's in China, that concept never existed. In China, the idea of order was that China...
I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Henry Kissinger. Let's roll the video.
Your champagne, Mr. Burnside.
Thank you.
You're sitting in seat 2A. Wonder who'll be sitting next to you in seat 2B.
Your seat, sir.
Hey,
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
it's Henry Kissinger. Ready for a good chat?
Well, that was a bit of a harrowing meeting, wasn't it? Isn't it nice to have a moment to relax and decompress?
Good morning.
Oh, look, it's Eric Schmidt. Ready for a nice chat? The Economist. Broaden your horizons.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the real Dr. Kissinger. Thank you, Henry. If you looked at that ad with me, I'm carrying your book when I get into the elevator. Thank you all for coming. Dr. Kissinger and I have talked for a long time about the future